Jim Ryong's hand trembled against Kyoma's throat. Not squeezing, just holding her there like gravity had shifted and she was the only solid thing left in his world. He'd murdered men without blinking, orchestrated violence across 3 continents with surgical precision. But this woman beneath his palm, her pulse racing against his fingers, unmade him with nothing but her presence. "Jim," she whispered, and his carefully constructed control shattered like crystal. He tried to pull back, tried to remember the rules he'd carved into his bones over 20 years of survival. Distance equals safety, emotion equals weakness, attachment equals death. But his body refused the order. His other hand fisted in the silk of her nightgown, pulling her closer even as his mind screamed at him to let go. "I told myself I wouldn't touch you," he growled, the words scraping raw from somewhere deep in his chest. His breath came ragged against her ear, and he hated how desperate he sounded, how human. "I told myself you were just another obligation, a transaction, something I could control." Her fingers brushed his jaw, and the touch burned. "But I can't." The confession died as his lips crashed against hers, swallowing his own weakness. For the first time in 20 years, Jim Ryong broke his own rules. And the worst part? He didn't care. Now wait. Before we discover how one innocent woman brought the most dangerous man in Seoul to his knees. Pause the video right now. If you want to see Jim Ryong completely unravel, and trust me, this man doesn't just fall, he crashes. Smash that like button and subscribe because what happens next will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about power and obsession. This isn't your typical arranged marriage story. This is about a mafia king who's never lost control meeting the one woman who makes him forget every rule he's built his empire on. And let me tell you, when Jim breaks, he breaks hard. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? I read every single one and I want to know. Are you team Jim needs to keep his distance or team burn it all down for her? Because by the end of this story, there won't be any middle ground. Now let's dive in. Jim Ryong was reviewing a shipment manifest when the phone rang. Not his business line, not the encrypted device his lieutenants used for time-sensitive operations. The private line. The one that existed for exactly 3 people, and 2 of them were already dead. He stared at the screen, and something cold settled in his stomach. Grandmother. Jim's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Madame Ryong didn't call for pleasantries. She didn't ask about his health or discuss the weather over Seoul. When his grandmother called, empires shifted. People disappeared. Legacies were made or buried. He let it ring twice, a petty rebellion he'd regret, before answering with the controlled neutrality that had kept him alive in rooms full of men who'd kill him for showing weakness. "Yes, grandmother." Her voice sliced through the speaker, sharp and absolute. No warmth, no preamble. "Come to the compound, now." 3 words, that was all. No explanation, no request. Just the weight of decades of power compressed into a command that didn't recognize the concept of no. The line went dead. Jim sat motionless for exactly 5 seconds, his face carved from stone. But behind that mask, his mind was already moving, rearranging the next 48 hours like pieces on a chessboard. The arms deal in Busan, the territorial negotiation with the Russians, the interrogation scheduled for tonight. All of it became irrelevant. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket with mechanical precision, and walked out of his glass-walled office overlooking the Seoul skyline. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, a predator that never showed fear. "Kang Min," he said without breaking stride. His second-in-command materialized from the shadows like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Clear my schedule. Everything." "For how long?" Jim's silence was answer enough. When Madame Ryong summoned him, time became irrelevant. By the time he reached the elevator, his entire operation was already adapting to his absence. Deals were being postponed, meetings rescheduled, territory patrols doubled. The Ryong syndicate moved like a living organism, and Jim Ryong was its brain. But as the elevator descended 40 floors toward the underground garage where his car waited, Jim allowed himself one moment of something that might have been unease. Madame Ryong was dying. Everyone knew it, though no one dared speak it aloud. And dying matriarchs didn't summon their heirs for small matters. They summoned them for reckonings. The night Jim Ryong was summoned to the inner wing of the family compound, the house felt smaller than it ever had. The corridors he had once raced through as a boy now pressed in on him, walls breathing with the weight of memory and money and blood. Outside, Seoul slept behind iron gates, unaware that an old promise was about to be dragged back into the light. Madame Ryong lay propped against silk pillows, her body reduced to angles and shadows. Cancer had taken its time with her, stripping away flesh but sharpening her eyes. Those eyes followed Jim as he entered, measured him the way she always had, as if weighing whether he was still worthy of the name he carried. The air smelled of medicine and incense, a blend of science and superstition that suited her. "You came late," she said, voice thin but steady. "I came when you called," Jim replied. He remained standing. He had learned long ago that sitting in her presence was an invitation to be judged. She smiled faintly. "You always did confuse obedience with respect." He said nothing. Jim Ryong had built the family empire into something feared and envied, and he had done it by never apologizing. He had survived rivals, betrayals, and boardroom wars. A dying old woman, even one as formidable as his grandmother, did not unsettle him. Or so he told himself. She gestured to the chair beside the bed. This time he sat. "There is a debt," she said after a long pause. "One you do not know, but one that owns us all the same." Jim gave a dry laugh. "If this is another lesson about humility, save your breath. I've paid for everything this family has." Her gaze hardened. "That is exactly why you will listen." She spoke then of Lagos, of heat and chaos and a night 20 years earlier when bullets tore through a hotel where she had been negotiating territory. A rival syndicate had tried to erase her from the board in one swift move. Her guards were cut down. Escape routes vanished. She was certain she would die there, far from home, her body left as a message. Then a stranger intervened. Chukwuma Obiora, a Nigerian oil executive with no stake in her war, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or perhaps, she said, the right place. He pulled her into a service corridor, shielded her with his own body, and got her out through a back stairwell while gunfire echoed behind them. He took a bullet meant for her and never spoke of it again. By the time she tried to thank him properly, he had returned to his life, asking only that the debt be remembered. Jim listened with a look that hovered between disbelief and amusement. "So," he said when she finished, "you're telling me the Ryong Empire exists because of a good Samaritan with poor timing." Her lips curved. "Mock if you wish. He saved my life, and before he died he called in that debt." She told him about Kioma, about vultures circling her father's estate, men who smelled weakness and moved fast. Chukwuma had known his daughter would be crushed between lawsuits and quiet threats. He had asked for protection, not money. Protection with teeth. Jim leaned back. "And you promised him what, exactly? A security detail? Lawyers?" "I promised him family." The word landed heavier than any threat. Jim laughed again, louder this time. "You want me to play guardian angel to a woman I've never met because of a story from before I took my first drink?" Madame Ryong's hand tightened on the silk sheet. "You will marry her." Silence stretched. Even the machines seemed to hold their breath. "That's absurd," Jim said. "You don't arrange marriages in my world. You buy loyalty. You crush resistance." She turned her head toward the window, where dawn was just beginning to stain the sky. "You think the world you built exists without consequence. You think blood only runs forward. It does not." He stood, irritation flashing. "Find Dae-hyun then. Let him play savior." At the sound of that name, she looked back at him, pity softening her features. "If you refuse, everything becomes his. The companies, the accounts." "The men who answer to your voice today will answer to his tomorrow." Jim felt something cold settle in his chest. Dae-hyun was competent, patient, and waiting, a man who smiled while sharpening knives. "You have 5 days," she said. 5 days to honor a promise older than your pride." As Jim turned to leave, laughter died in his throat. For the first time since he had taken control of the empire, the ground beneath him shifted. Not because of enemies or markets or violence, but because of a man long dead and a daughter he could not yet picture. Outside, the compound gates loomed, as they always had. But now they felt less like protection and more like a countdown, closing in with every step. The envelope waited on his desk like a small accusation. Heavy paper, clean edges, the kind that assumed it would be opened without ceremony. Jim slid it once and tipped the contents into his hand. A thin dossier slid out, followed by a single photograph that caught the light before he meant it to. Kioma Obiora, 25. Economics degree, University of Lagos, recently orphaned. The facts read flat, almost dull, but the image refused to be ordinary. The woman in the photograph did not smile. She faced the camera as if she understood the terms of the exchange and had agreed to none of them. Her skin held a deep, steady glow, not polished, not softened. Her eyes were alert, measuring, as though she were the one assessing the person who would someday hold this picture. Grief had left its mark. There was no mistaking that. But it had not bent her posture or dulled her gaze. Something in her carried forward, intact. Jim set the photograph on the desk and leaned back, fingers steepled, studying it the way he studied balance sheets and border maps. Detachment came easily to him. He had learned it early, learned it well. People were variables. Attachments were liabilities. The world he moved through had no patience for sentiment, and he had survived by keeping his emotions as organized as his accounts. This woman was an obligation, not a choice. A name attached to a debt that had outlived its owner. He told himself that as his eyes returned to the photograph, again and again, mapping details without permission. The tilt of her head suggested resolve. The set of her mouth suggested restraint rather than fear. She looked like someone who had learned to stand upright when the ground gave way. He closed the folder and left the photograph out, face up. Control began with visibility. He needed to know what he was dealing with before the world complicated it for him. A soft knock broke the quiet. Kang Min entered without waiting, as he always did, his presence measured and exact. He did not look at the photograph at first. He looked at Jim. "Dae-hyun is talking," Kang Min said, voice low. "He's telling people you've gone gentle. Says you're collecting promises instead of enforcing them." Jim did not react. He had heard worse from better men. Kang Min stepped closer, finally letting his gaze drop to the desk. His eyes paused on the photograph for half a second too long. "He's asking questions about her, spreading stories before he has proof. That's how he works." Jim picked up the photograph and slid it back into the folder, sealing it with a practiced motion. "Let him talk," he said. "Noise is not power. Noise attracts attention," Kang Min replied, "and attention brings mistakes." Jim stood and crossed to the window. The city below moved with its usual confidence, unaware of the quiet negotiations that decided which lights stayed on and which went dark. He preferred it that way. "Daehyun wants me to react," he said. "He wants me to deny something I haven't admitted." Kang Min waited. He knew better than to interrupt when Jim's voice went cold and even. "She doesn't enter my world," Jim continued. "She stays adjacent to it, separate, managed." He turned back to the desk, eyes sharp. "Get me everything on the Obiora girl, school records, friends, habits. I want to know who speaks for her and who profits from her silence." Kang Min nodded, already sorting the task. "And where do you want her?" Jim did not hesitate. "Prepare the penthouse. Full staff rotation, vetted. She stays where I can control the situation." There it was. Not concern, not protection. Control, stated plainly, without apology. Kang Min hesitated this time, just enough to be noticed. People will talk. They always do. Daehyun will see it as weakness. Jim met his lieutenant's eyes. "Daehyun confuses visibility with vulnerability. That's why he's predictable." Kang Min accepted the answer, though unease lingered. He turned to leave, then stopped. "She doesn't look like someone who bends easily," he said, gesturing once toward the desk. Jim allowed himself a brief, humorless smile. "Neither do I." When the door closed, the room felt larger. Jim returned to the desk and opened the folder again, slower this time. He studied the lines of Kyoma's face with the same care he gave to fault lines and escape routes. He told himself this was preparation. Risk management. Nothing more. Still, the image held, not pleading, not broken, standing. He imagined her stepping into the penthouse, measuring the space the way she had measured the camera. He imagined the questions she would not ask aloud. He imagined the way Daehyun would twist the story once he learned where she was staying. Let him. Jim closed the folder and placed it in the drawer beside his chair, locking it with a soft click. Some obligations could be postponed. Others had to be brought close, where they could be watched. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that a photograph had just shifted the balance of things. Kyoma arrived at Incheon Airport with a single suitcase and the kind of stillness that comes after too many sleepless nights. Her body moved with purpose, but her eyes carried the quiet weight of months spent mourning a man who had taught her how to listen before speaking, how to watch before trusting. The terminal buzzed around her, bright screens and clipped announcements, yet she seemed wrapped in a private silence, as though the world had learned to lower its voice around her grief. She passed through immigration without hesitation, her documents neat, her answers brief. Nothing about her suggested confusion or awe. She did not pause to stare or search for wonder. She had not come to be impressed. She had come because a promise demanded it. Jim Ryong waited in the VIP terminal, hands in the pockets of his coat, posture rigid with control. He had seen countless arrivals, politicians, rivals, women sent as offerings, men arriving in fear. But this was different. He had expected nerves, hesitation, perhaps even rehearsed obedience. Instead, he saw a woman who walked toward him as if she had already measured the ground beneath her feet and found it solid enough to stand on. She stopped a few steps away. Their eyes met for the first time, and the air shifted. Jim's gaze moved over her slowly, not crude, not hurried, but sharp, as if cataloging facts he might later need. He noted the plain coat, the unadorned face, the tension she carried without apology. He found no softness to exploit, no obvious cracks. Kyoma did not look away. "I know what you are," she said quietly, her voice steady, carrying neither challenge nor submission. "My father told me stories about the Ryong family before he died. I'm here to honor his wish and protect what's mine. Nothing more. The words landed harder than any accusation. Jim felt something tighten behind his ribs, an irritation he did not recognize at first. People usually begged, threatened, or tried to bargain. This woman stated her terms as if they already existed, as if he were simply another factor to account for. He inclined his head once, a gesture more reflex than courtesy, and turned toward the exit. She followed without being asked. The car ride into the city passed in silence, the windows tinted, the city sliding by like a foreign dream. Neither of them cared to claim. Jim broke the quiet when the car merged onto a long stretch of road, his voice calm, stripped of warmth. "There are rules," he said. "We live under the same roof, nothing more. Separate bedrooms. You don't ask about my work, you don't interfere with it. No emotional expectations." She listened, hands folded in her lap, eyes forward. "I agree," she replied. No pause, no negotiation. He glanced at her then, truly looked, and felt that irritation deepen into something sharper. Agreement usually came with relief or fear. Her face held neither. Only resolve. The penthouse sat high above the city, glass and steel rising into the sky like a silent declaration of dominance. Jim dismissed the driver and stepped out first, the building's private entrance sealing behind them. The elevator ride was brief, the quiet thick enough to press against his ears. When the doors opened, he led her inside, keycard sliding home with a soft click. The space revealed itself in stages, wide windows, dark floors, restrained luxury that spoke of power rather than taste. He moved ahead of her, explaining nothing, assuming she would follow. As he reached for the door, his hand brushed hers. It was accidental, brief, barely there. Yet the contact sent a jolt through him so sudden he almost withdrew as if burned. Something cracked open in his chest, sharp and unwelcome, a sensation he had spent years learning to suppress. He turned the handle with more force than necessary, jaw tightening. Keoma felt it too, not the same fracture, but the shift. She stilled for half a breath, then continued forward, refusing to let a moment define her. "This is your room," he said, opening the door to a space prepared but impersonal, untouched by anything that might invite comfort. "Mine is down the hall." She stepped inside, setting her suitcase down with care, as though placing something fragile. When she turned back to him, her expression had softened just enough to reveal fatigue, the kind earned through endurance rather than weakness. "I don't plan to be a problem," she said. "I've survived worse than silence." The words unsettled him more than any threat could have. He nodded once, retreating down the hall, his steps measured, his mind anything but. He told himself it was nothing, an accident, a moment of distraction. Yet, as he closed his own door behind him, the echo of that brief touch lingered, a reminder that control, once disturbed, rarely returned untouched. Across the penthouse, Keoma lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of a life not her own. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears wasted strength. She closed her eyes and breathed, steady and calm, knowing she had stepped into a house built on power and secrets. Neither of them slept easily that night, and both understood, without naming it, that something had already begun, something neither rule nor resolve would fully contain. The room was too small for grandeur, too quiet for joy. The Ryong compound's private hall had been cleared of everything but a lacquered table, 2 candles, and the people who mattered, or rather, those who were allowed to matter. Madame Ryong sat in her wheelchair near the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap like she was cradling the ghost of something precious. Kangmin stood beside her, his eyes watchful, unreadable. Behind him, a pair of soldiers in pressed uniforms stood guard, still as shadows. There was no music, no laughter, no scent of flowers, just the faint hum of the heating system, and the soft whisper of Madame Ryong's breathing. Jim stood at the center of it all, his posture straight, his face a mask of calm efficiency. The suit fit him perfectly, though he hadn't chosen it. Kang Min had sent it up that morning, pressed and waiting, with a note that read only, "Be ready by 7." Across from him, Kioma stood in a white dress that was too simple to be bridal and too beautiful to be dismissed. The fabric caught the light when she moved, like frost trembling on the edge of dawn. Her eyes did not meet his. They were fixed somewhere just beyond him, on the candlelight perhaps, or on her own thoughts. The officiant spoke first in Korean, his voice low and practiced, as if he had recited these words 100 times before and had long stopped listening to their meaning. Jim caught fragments, the formalities, the pledges, the signatures. When the same words were repeated in English, they sounded thinner, almost brittle, stripped of their ceremony. It was not a union of hearts. It was a deal, sealed in vowels and syllables. Madame Ryong watched with the calm detachment of someone who had seen too many such arrangements. Her eyes lingered on Kioma, not unkindly, but with a kind of sad curiosity, like she was trying to memorize the contours of someone else's sacrifice. Kang Min's hands stayed behind his back, his stance perfect, but his jaw tightened slightly when Jim's name was spoken. Then came the moment. The officiant turned to Jim, gave a small nod. "You may kiss the bride." Jim moved on command. "The way a soldier moves when an order has been given." He leaned in, his hand hovering awkwardly near Kioma's waist before resting there, barely. Their eyes met for the first time that evening. Hers were dark and still, like deep water. He hesitated, not from shyness, but calculation. Then he kissed her. 2 seconds. He'd timed it in his head before it even happened. Long enough to appear real, short enough to remain businesslike. His lips met hers, soft and warm, and for that sliver of time, the air seemed to still. There was something in the warmth, unexpected, unwelcome, that stirred a flicker of memory. A scent of summer, perhaps, or the quiet before rain. His chest tightened, and for the briefest heartbeat, Jim forgot to breathe. When he pulled away, her face was unreadable. The officiant closed the book with a soft thud, and that was that. No applause followed, no congratulations. Madame Ryong's attendant wheeled her forward so she could touch Kioma's hand, a gesture that was more acknowledgement than blessing. Kang Min offered a stiff bow. Jim turned toward the door, already thinking of the documents waiting on his desk, the logistics that demanded his attention. The soldiers stepped aside to let him pass, their faces expressionless. The night outside was brittle with cold. He walked across the compound toward the main office, the sound of his shoes sharp against the stone. The stars were faint, smothered by the city's glow, and the air smelled faintly of salt from the distant sea. He unlocked his office, turned on the desk lamp, and sat. The familiar maps and ledgers lay open where he had left them, lines and numbers that made more sense than people ever could. He worked until 4 in the morning. At least he told himself it was work. His pen moved over routes and codes, calculating shipments, adjusting timelines. But every so often his mind would drift unbidden to the brief weight of her hand, the softness of her lips. He rubbed at the tightness in his chest as though it could be reasoned away, dismissed as fatigue, or maybe indigestion, or stress. When the first hint of dawn began to filter through the blinds, he closed the ledger and sat back, staring at nothing. Across the compound, Kioma lay awake in the guest room that had been prepared for her. The bed was too large, the sheets too crisp. She had been told this was temporary, until things were settled. She had nodded, said nothing. The silence pressed against her ears like a physical thing. She could hear the distant hum of a generator, the faint shuffle of guards outside the door. She touched her lips. The gesture was small, almost involuntary. They still felt warm. She remembered the firmness of his mouth, the precision of it, like a man performing a task rather than an act of affection. But beneath that control there had been something else, something she could not name. Not kindness, not tenderness exactly, but a hesitation that felt almost human. It unsettled her. She turned on her side, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man kissed like that. A man bound by duty, or a man who had forgotten how to feel. The thought lingered, circling her mind like a moth against glass. Somewhere down the hall she heard footsteps, measured and steady, then silence again. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and uneasy. Jim, in his office, sat with his head in his hands, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines. The candles from the ceremony had long since burned out, but the scent of wax still clung to his clothes. Outside, the first birds began to call. Another day was beginning, indifferent to vows, to kisses, to the quiet wars that lived behind closed doors. 2 weeks into the marriage, the penthouse had settled into a quiet rhythm of avoidance. Jim moved through the rooms like a soldier on reconnaissance, every step measured, every silence deliberate. Keoma learned the pattern of his presence, the muted shuffle of his boots before dawn, the scent of gun oil and aftershave lingering long after he'd left for the day. They lived in parallel, 2 lines that shared the same coordinates but never touched. Even the staff felt it, the way the air tightened when they crossed paths, the way conversation dimmed to whispers as if any sudden sound might shatter the fragile truce between husband and wife. She tried at first, little gestures, leaving a cup of coffee on the table near where he sat reading reports, thanking him for the smallest courtesies, asking about his day with a politeness that held no expectations. Each attempt was met with the same cool civility, his replies brief, his eyes averted, his expression unreadable. He wasn't cruel, he was distant, as though he'd locked away everything human behind a wall she wasn't meant to breach. The nights were the hardest. The city glowed beneath the penthouse balcony, restless and alive, a world she could watch but no longer touch. Sleep rarely came. Memories of her father lingered like ghosts, the warmth of his laughter, the cadence of his voice as he told her stories about courage and faith, about never letting grief swallow you whole. But here, surrounded by marble and silence, those lessons felt like relics from another lifetime. That night, the air carried a thin edge of rain. Keoma stood on the balcony barefoot, her nightdress fluttering against her legs, the framed photograph of her father clutched to her chest. The city lights blurred through her tears, a constellation of loss. She didn't hear Jim's footsteps until he was already there, the sliding door whispering open behind her. He froze in the doorway, the dim light outlining the rigid set of his shoulders. For a moment he considered turning back, retreating into the safe emptiness of the guest room he'd claimed as his own. But something in the sight before him stopped him cold, the tremor in her shoulders, the way she held the photo like a lifeline. His grandmother's voice rose unbidden in his mind, the memory so sharp it almost hurt. "Honor is not just duty, boy. It is seeing the humanity in your obligations." He'd been 14 when she said it, her frail hand gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Back then, he hadn't understood. Honor was obedience, discipline, loyalty, nothing more. Humanity had been a luxury, and luxuries were for the weak. But now, watching Keoma fold in on herself beneath the weight of her grief, the words cracked open something he hadn't realized was still alive in him. He stepped forward slowly, careful not to startle her. The night wind brushed his hair across his forehead, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the balcony plants she'd insisted on keeping alive. She didn't turn, not even when he stood beside her, close enough to feel the tremor of her breath. For a long time, neither spoke. The city murmured below them, the hum of traffic and distant sirens filling the spaces their silence left behind. Keoma's tears slowed, her breathing uneven but steadying. Jim's hands hung at his sides, clenched tight enough that the knuckles whitened. Every instinct told him to walk away, to keep the distance that had kept him safe all these years. Yet, he stayed. Minutes passed, 10, maybe 20. She shifted, her head tilting slightly, and when exhaustion finally overcame her, she leaned against his shoulder. The contact was so light he almost doubted it at first. Then her weight settled, her breathing deepened, and the photo slipped from her fingers, landing softly on the balcony tiles. Jim stared ahead, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The warmth of her cheek against his arm felt foreign, disarming. Something in him stirred, a faint pulse of emotion he didn't have a name for. When she finally drifted into sleep, he turned slightly, careful not to wake her. He hesitated before moving, the soldier in him calculating the logistics of every motion. Then, with a slow exhale, he slipped one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back, and lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, fragile in a way that made him acutely aware of every breath she took. Inside, the penthouse was dim and still. He carried her through the hall, her hair brushing against his forearm, the faint scent of lavender from her skin clinging to him like a memory. When he reached the bedroom, he laid her gently on the bed, pulling the blanket up to her shoulders. For a long moment he stood there, studying her face, the traces of salt on her cheeks, the furrow in her brow that hadn't yet eased even in sleep. Something unguarded flickered through him, quick and painful. He reached out before he could stop himself, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. His fingers lingered for just an instant longer than necessary. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke in Korean, words he hadn't used in years. "You're safe here." It wasn't an order, or an oath, or the kind of promise men like him usually made. It was something softer, raw. The first promise that carried no trace of duty, no shadow of violence, only the faint, tentative spark of something human. He stood there a moment longer, watching her breathe, before turning away. As he left the room, the city's lights spilled through the window, washing the floor in silver. For the first time in years, Jim felt the weight of his armor, not the one forged of steel and silence, but the one he'd built around his heart, begin, just slightly, to crack. The air in the room was thick with cigar smoke and power, the kind that hummed beneath polished floors and clinked inside crystal glasses. The syndicate's quarterly gathering was never truly about business. It was about dominance, about who could smile the widest while sharpening the longest blade behind it. Jim had attended dozens of these affairs, but this one carried a strange, pulsing charge. Maybe it was the way Dae-hun lingered too close, his eyes darting toward Keoma with that smirk, the kind men wore when they thought they had found a weakness. Keoma stood by Jim's side, her chin tilted just slightly upward, her posture perfect. She wore grace like armor. The emerald silk of her dress seemed to defy the room's ugliness. But Jim could see the undercurrent in the eyes that followed her, the silent assessments, the cruel curiosity. Then came the first remark, sly and snickering. "So this is the African import, huh?" Dae-hyun's voice slithered through the murmurs of the crowd. "Did you pick her up on auction day, Jim, or was it one of those humanitarian acquisitions?" Laughter rippled from the corners of the room, thin, nervous, the kind that begged to die in someone's throat. Keoma didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed fixed, steady as iron, though a faint tremor rippled through her fingers. Dae-hyun pressed on, emboldened by the silence. "I must say, you've got an eye for the exotic. Does she come with a return policy, or do you plan on keeping her until she learns English? The laughter died this time. Too sharp, too far. Even the ice in the glasses seemed to hesitate. Jim's stillness was worse than rage. He didn't look at Daehyun. His gaze rested on the rim of his glass, as though he were weighing the cost of what would come next. Inside him, something ancient and territorial surged, something that recognized what Keoma meant now. Not a debt, not a favor, not even a complication. She was his, and anyone who thought otherwise would learn the lesson in blood. He set his glass down with a soft click. The sound was quiet, almost delicate, yet it sliced through the murmurs like a blade. Daehyun, Jim said, voice calm, too calm. You've had a good run, but I think you've forgotten your place. Daehyun straightened, confusion flickering in his eyes. It was a joke. Jim's hand moved in a small, almost absent gesture, and two of his men stepped forward. The entire room tensed. Power shifted, palpable and cold. Strip him, Jim said, voice low, clipped. Every minor territory, every asset tied to his name. Effective immediately. The words dropped like a guillotine. Daehyun's mouth opened, a protest trembling on his lips, but Jim didn't give him the chance. You humiliated my wife in front of my table, he continued, his tone turning to steel. You thought it would earn you laughter. Instead, it earns you nothing. He took Keoma's hand, guiding her a step closer, his arm sliding around her waist. Not possessive, not tender, but a declaration written in flesh. His eyes swept over the stunned faces around them. My wife is untouchable, Jim said, voice like razors against silk. Spread the word. Silence followed, deep and cavernous. No one met his gaze. No one dared. Daehyun was already being escorted out, his face pale, his empire dissolving with every step. The room swallowed its discomfort, and business resumed as though nothing had happened. But everyone knew everything had changed. Later, in the quiet of their suite, the weight of the night hung between them. Keoma stood by the window, her reflection framed by the city lights below. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the gathering. Jim loosened his tie, waiting for her to break the silence. When she finally turned, her voice was steady but edged. I don't need you to fight my battles. Jim looked up, something flickering behind his eyes. Amusement maybe, but darker. In my world you do, he said. Her gaze hardened. Your world doesn't scare me. He stepped closer, close enough for her to feel the tension radiating from him. It should, he murmured. These people don't fight fair. They don't stop when you stand your ground. They stop when someone bleeds for it. You think that speech tonight was for them? It was for you, so you'd understand what line you're standing behind. Keoma's breath caught, her pulse thrumming at the base of her throat. And what line is that? Jim's eyes lingered on her, his voice lowering to something almost dangerous. Mine. I don't share, Keoma. Not respect. Not loyalty. And not you. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The tension was electric, hovering between anger and something far more volatile. Keoma wanted to speak, to push back, to tell him she wasn't his possession, but the words tangled in her chest. Because beneath the fury there was something else, something in the way he had said my wife, in the way he had wrapped an arm around her and looked at Daehyun like he was already a ghost. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even protection. It was a declaration, a claim written in the language of power and blood. Jim turned away first, lighting a cigarette, exhaling slowly. You want to survive in this life, Keoma? He asked, his tone roughened by smoke and something deeper. Then stop mistaking brutality for choice. We don't get choices. We get consequences. She crossed her arms, her voice quieter now. And what about love? Does that fit anywhere in your world of consequences? He paused, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth, an expression caught between bitterness and truth. Love's just the prettiest kind of consequence, he said finally. For a long time, neither of them spoke again. Outside, the city pulsed with neon and deceit, and inside that room, something unspoken shifted between them, something irrevocable. It wasn't tenderness, not yet, but it was a beginning forged in fire. The nights grew longer in the hideout, stretched thin between the weight of silence and the low hum of a generator outside. Jim found himself lingering in the common room more often than he wanted to. The sharp edges of routine, keeping distance, staying alert, never letting anyone too close, had started to dull under the steady pull of Keoma's presence. It wasn't deliberate the way she drew him in, she just talked. She talked about home, about her father, about the noise of Lagos at dawn when the muezzin's call braided with the city's heartbeat. She spoke of the hospital her father built in Port Harcourt, the school for girls he funded in a village that barely had electricity. Her voice softened when she told him how he'd say, "Oil is only useful if it builds something that outlives us." Jim never meant to listen, but in the flicker of the dim light, with the world outside still hunting for them, her words seeped in. They came to him later, uninvited, when he tried to sleep. Images of dusty playgrounds and hospital wards, of her father's hands resting on blueprints stained with coffee and sweat. One night, she caught him watching her as she spoke. "You think he was naive?" she said, smiling faintly, not looking up from the cup she was warming between her palms. "I think he was lucky," Jim replied. "Not everyone gets to build instead of destroy." She looked at him then, and he saw the reflection of the man he had become. Hard lines, old scars, eyes that had forgotten softness. "Maybe," she said, "but you can still build something too." He almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. "I buried that part of me a long time ago." She didn't press him, not at first. But later, when the night thickened and only the wind moved through the compound, she found him sitting by the window, gun resting on the table beside him. "Tell me," she said quietly. He looked at her, at the curve of her face lit by the faint blue light, and something inside him slipped. For years, he had carried the story like a curse. The night he took over the syndicate wasn't just blood and noise. It was the night he stopped being Jim and became someone else entirely. The betrayal had come from men he'd called brothers. The gunfire had been loud, but the silence after was worse. He'd stepped over bodies and realized he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. Survival demanded it. Humanity didn't. He told her everything. The names, the faces, the way the rain fell that night, washing the blood into the gutters. How afterward he'd looked in the mirror and seen a stranger staring back. Keoma listened without flinching. When he finished, she didn't recoil. She didn't reach for comfort either. She just looked at him and said softly, "You're not a monster, Jim. Monsters don't remember what they've lost." The words hit him harder than any bullet. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. No one had ever said that to him, not his men, not the ghosts that followed him through every job. He felt something raw and dangerous stir inside him, something he'd fought to bury under steel and silence. Later, when the compound had gone quiet, he found himself outside her door. He hadn't meant to walk there. His body just moved, guided by a pull he couldn't name. He stood with his fist against the wood, every instinct screaming at him to walk away. He could hear her breathing faintly inside, could almost see her sitting there, waiting, though he knew she wouldn't expect him. He didn't knock. He just stood there, jaw clenched, heart hammering with the kind of fear he hadn't felt since he was a boy. The door stayed closed, but the distance between them felt thinner than ever. For the first time in years, he wanted something he couldn't simply take. After a long minute, he lowered his hand. He turned away, the sound of his own footsteps echoing down the narrow hall. But the air had shifted. The walls he'd built, years of discipline, detachment, denial, had started to crack. Every conversation, every lingering glance had chipped at them, until now they barely held. Back in his room, he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. The night outside was heavy with heat, and through the thin walls he could hear the faint rustle of Kioma moving in her room. It was unbearable. The closeness, the ache of restraint. He rubbed a hand over his face. The ghosts of old sins pressing down on him, but underneath them, something else stirred, something frighteningly human. He thought of her father again, of building, not breaking, of hands that healed instead of destroyed. He wondered if it was possible for men like him to change, or if redemption was just a story people told themselves to sleep better. When dawn finally crept in, soft and reluctant, he was still awake. The compound began to stir, and the brief calm between them would soon be broken by the day's demands. But as he stepped out into the pale light, he saw Kioma in the courtyard, her hair loose, her face turned toward the morning. She looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the world narrowed to that single glance. No words, no pretense, just two people standing in the wreckage of their own defenses. Jim looked away first, pretending to check his watch, pretending it hadn't meant anything, but deep down, he knew. Something had already begun to unravel, quietly and completely. The walls were falling, and they both knew it. Night spread over the city like a bruise, the skyline pulsing with the dull glow of danger. Jim felt it before he heard the news, the shift in the air, the way the silence seemed to tighten around him. By the time his men burst into the room with word that a rival crew had moved on one of his warehouses, he was already reaching for his gun. He didn't wait for the full report. The name of the syndicate was enough. He'd given them warnings before, quiet, professional, merciful by his standards. But mercy had a short lifespan in his world, and tonight it was dead. He moved through the chaos like a storm. His convoy tore through the streets, engines snarling, the city lights blurring past. When they reached the site, smoke was already crawling up from the docks, gunfire echoing off the metal walls. Jim didn't hesitate. His men fanned out, and he went straight for the heart of it, the warehouse office where he knew they'd be holding leverage. And there she was, Kioma. Hands bound, a rough cloth over her mouth, two men dragging her toward a waiting van. For a moment, something inside him stopped working. The sound, the movement, the rage, it all condensed into one clear thought. Not her. What happened next wasn't strategy. It wasn't even war. It was annihilation. Jim moved through them like a force of nature, bullets finding targets with precision, rage fueling every motion. He didn't shout orders. He didn't speak at all. The men who'd touched her didn't get the mercy of dying quickly. When it was over, the night was silent again, except for the crackle of fire consuming the building. He stood there, covered in blood and ash, staring at the flames. Something primal had taken root in him, something he didn't want to name. When he turned back, Kioma was watching him, not afraid, not shocked, just watching, as if she was seeing him for the first time. He didn't remember the drive back, just the city sliding past in red streaks, the taste of smoke in his throat, his hands still trembling from everything he'd done. When they reached the penthouse, Kioma said nothing. She guided him to the bathroom, her fingers steady as she reached for a towel and a bowl of water. The steam rose between them as she dipped the cloth and began to clean his hands, his face, the blood that had dried along his jaw. He should have told her to stop. She shouldn't have had to see him like this. But when her fingers brushed his skin, something inside him cracked. "You're shaking," she whispered, her voice low, careful. He didn't answer. His throat felt raw, his chest hollowed out. He looked at her, the softness of her eyes, the faint tremor in her own hands, the streak of grime across her cheek, and something in him broke open. "I almost lost you," he said finally. The words scraped out of him, heavy and uneven. "I can't." But the rest never came. The sentence hung between them, unfinished, too dangerous to name. He kissed her instead. There was nothing controlled about it, nothing calculated. It wasn't the kiss of a man trying to possess. It was the kiss of someone who'd just stared down death and realized what he couldn't afford to lose. She didn't pull away. Her hands slid up to his neck, holding him there, grounding him as the chaos inside him roared. The room blurred. The world shrank to the press of her mouth, the sound of their breathing, the rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. Every wall he'd built, every rule he'd lived by, crumbled under the weight of that moment. When he finally broke the kiss, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing hard, the air thick with smoke and want. "I can't stop," he murmured against her lips. The words came out like a confession, like surrender. "I've tried, but I can't stop wanting you." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her fingers found his again, tracing the lines of his palm as if memorizing them. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere far below, the city still burning from what he'd done. But in that high, quiet space above it all, there was only them. Two people bound together by something they didn't understand, something that terrified them both. Jim had spent his life mastering control, deals, violence, loyalty. Everything had a price. Everything could be managed. But not this. Not her. When Keoma leaned in again, it wasn't out of fear or confusion. It was choice, and that made it worse. Because as her lips met his once more, soft but certain, he knew that the line he'd sworn never to cross was gone. There was no going back to the man who could walk away, no rebuilding the walls he'd torn down. She drew back just enough to look at him. Her eyes searched his face as if trying to read the truth behind all the scars and shadows. "Then don't stop," she whispered. The words hit him harder than any bullet. He exhaled, a sound caught somewhere between a groan and a sigh, and let himself fall into her again. The city could burn, the rivals could regroup, the empire could crumble. But right now, none of it mattered. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about control or survival or vengeance, just her, the warmth of her skin, the way she steadied his shaking hands, the quiet strength in her touch. He knew he was too far gone. And as dawn began to bleed through the curtains, washing the blood and smoke from the world outside, Jim held her close, feeling the last of his restraint slip away. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken in the wreckage he'd left behind, and in the way she still stayed, her heartbeat steady against his. He couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Madame Ryong's death came quietly, without fanfare, as if the universe itself held its breath out of respect or fear. The news reached Jim in the middle of a negotiation meeting, and for a long moment he didn't move. The woman who had taught him everything, how to build, how to destroy, how to read a man's heartbeat through silence, was gone. The empire she had built from blood and iron now lay in his hands, a crown heavy enough to crush him if he wasn't careful. Her will was simple. He would take full control, but only under one condition. He must decide the future of the syndicate, expand into darker territories, or step away and turn his power toward legitimacy. No middle ground, no compromises. Keoma stood beside him at the cremation ceremony, her hand brushing his, not demanding but steady. The ash rose into the soul night like a ghost dispersing into the city's electric veins. "She made you her heir," Keoma said softly. "That's not a blessing. It's a test." Jim didn't answer. He had spent his life surviving tests, bending every rule that stood in his way. But this one, this choice, felt like the first he couldn't solve with strategy or force. For a few weeks, the city seemed to hold still, as though it too was waiting for his decision. Then Daehyun struck. The first hit came quietly, a data breach at one of Keoma's father's companies, a sudden leak of financial records that sent investors scattering. The second was brutal, a fire at a warehouse tied to Jim's imports, masked as an accident but efficient enough to send a message. Daehyun wasn't just testing him, he was declaring war. Jim's men brought him reports every hour, territories shifting hands, associates defecting. The empire was bleeding, and Keoma's business, her father's legacy, was next in line. "You can't fight him without falling back into what you were," Keoma told him one night, her voice trembling not with fear, but conviction. They were in the penthouse, the same one that had once been a fortress of control. Now it felt too small for both his fury and her faith. "If I don't fight, he'll destroy everything," Jim replied. "You, me, the people who still believe in me." She stepped closer, her eyes steady. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe this is where you stop being the man everyone fears and start being the man you're meant to be." He wanted to argue, but the truth caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to strike back, to reclaim what was his. Yet, for the first time, he saw the cost, the endless loop of vengeance that had defined him. Madame Ryong's empire was built on control. Keoma's dream was built on restoration, and he stood in the middle, torn between two worlds that could never coexist. When Daehyun launched his full-scale assault, coordinated hits on Jim's suppliers, threats against Keoma's executives, Jim made his choice. He called in every favor, every shadow he'd ever owned. But instead of retaliation, he used his reach to expose Daehyun's corruption. The authorities found what they needed: money laundering, political bribery, trafficking. Jim didn't lift a gun, he lifted a phone. In 24 hours, Daehyun's network crumbled under the weight of its own sins. It wasn't mercy, it was evolution. When the news broke, the city buzzed with disbelief. The syndicate's most feared man had dismantled his rival without spilling blood. Some called it cowardice, others called it genius. Jim didn't care. He'd already made his peace. At dawn, he stood on the rooftop, watching the city breathe beneath him. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like waiting. It felt like release. He announced his decision to the council that afternoon, a partial retirement. He would keep enough control to protect his people, but the rest, everything he'd built through smoke and steel, would be handed to others. He would invest his power, his wealth, into Keoma's world, her father's companies, her vision of something clean. There were no objections. Only shock, maybe even a hint of respect. That night, the penthouse was different. No tension, no unspoken war. Just the city lights painting their reflections across glass and skin. Jim sat by the window, shirt unbuttoned, the dragon tattoo coiling across his shoulder like something half-tamed. Keoma crossed the room and stopped behind him, her fingers tracing the ink. "You've ruined me," he murmured, a dark smile tugging at his lips. "I can't go back to who I was." Her laugh was quiet, tender. "Good, because I like who you're becoming." He turned, and for once, when he touched her, it wasn't about power or claiming what was his. It was surrender, a wordless promise that the man who once ruled through fear now lived for something gentler, harder, infinitely more dangerous. Outside, the city hummed, the same city that had once made him a weapon and was now watching him become something else entirely. The dragon had not died. It had simply learned to sleep. And in the silence that followed, Jim finally understood what Madame Ryong's final condition truly meant. It was never about choosing between power and love. It was about learning that the only empire worth building was one that could survive without fear. Keoma leaned against him, the warmth of her body grounding him in the present. For the first time, Jim didn't feel the need to look over his shoulder. The empire could live or burn. The choice had already been made. If you felt that ending burn through your chest, hit that like button right now, because trust me, what's coming next will hit even harder. Go ahead, subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in Jim and Keoma's storm. Every choice, every betrayal, every heartbeat that follows. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Let's see how far this story has reached, from Seoul's neon nights to wherever you're watching this right now. See you in the next one.